Well, let's get back to this motion of non-confidence the Conservatives are hoping to table next week. Already, we're hearing the Bloc Québécois rejecting the idea even before it is officially tabled. So for his thoughts on this and other matters, including the by-elections that took place on Monday, we're now joined by polls analyst Eric Grenier, the man behind the Writ.ca. Check it out on Substack. Eric, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Listen, you know, clearly there's an incentive here for Conservatives to bring down this government. But I'm wondering, when you look at the polling numbers, the reasons and the arguments you're hearing and looking at from Canadians, when it comes to the Bloc, does it at all surprise you that they are, at this point, unwilling to support this motion?
Not really. I mean, you would look at where they are in the polls. They'd probably pick up seats if there was a new election. They just won a by-election in a seat they haven't held pretty much forever. But there isn't that much incentive for them to go to the polls because they're in a much better bargaining position than they've been for the last few years. And when you actually look at the polling in Quebec, Quebecers aren't as keen on going to an election because the Canadians who want an election tend to be Conservative voters. There's not as many of them in Quebec. So I think that the Bloc is actually following what most of their supporters would prefer, is that they extract more from the government rather than precipitate an election. Because the Conservatives right now are poised to win a big majority government. They wouldn't need a single seat in Quebec to do it, and they're only at about 20–25% support in Quebec. So there is an argument there for Blanchet to say English Canada would give Quebec a Conservative government, and as he said today, exchanging Justin Trudeau for Pierre Poilievre is not in what he thinks are Quebec's interests.
So at the end of the day, there is more political advantage for the Bloc Québécois for a minority Liberal government than, as you say, a Conservative majority. But what about the NDP? Is there at all incentive for them to bring down this government?
It's hard to see one. They might have seen the results in Elmwood-Transcona and think that was a good sign for them. The result was a good one for them, I'd say, but the result in La Salle-et-Verdun was not as good for them. The polls overall have been pretty rough for the New Democrats. It seems unlikely they would be able to pick up a lot of seats, if any, and more likely outcome would be that they would lose seats if there was an election right now. That being the case, an election might not be a good idea for Jagmeet Singh. The move from the Bloc at least might give some cover for the NDP to vote against the government, but if they do that next week, they'll probably have to do it again in a few weeks. And will they be able to come back, walk back on that paint? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so something to be watching out for. You know, and of course Conservatives, even though ultimately they want government, but when they talk about reasoning to bring down the government, we keep hearing this idea that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, they want a carbon tax election. So with that in mind, I'm wondering how much of an issue the carbon tax is, and maybe in a different way, is it at all winnable for the Liberals to keep holding on and defending the carbon tax?
It is a difficult issue for them. It isn't as unpopular as sometimes people discuss. It isn't an 80-20 issue that the vast majority of Canadians are against it. It all depends on how it's sold. When it's discussed as an issue to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, it's relatively, I wouldn't say popular, but it's not overly unpopular. When it is presented as a tax, when there's polling about the carbon tax increasing, very unpopular. So it isn't a good issue for the Liberals. It is a good issue for the Conservatives, primarily because they're the only one on that side of the issue. The NDP is starting to move away from it, though we'll see what they come out with. It doesn't apply in Quebec, so for the Bloc Québécois, it's not an issue at all. So the Conservatives, when they're the only one owning the anti-carbon tax issue, it doesn't matter if it is 50–60% rather than 80–90% unpopular. That's a lot of votes that are there for Pierre Poilievre.
Mm-hmm. And for people at home, if you're wondering why it doesn't apply to Quebec, it's because Quebec has a cap-and-trade system that is not part of the federal backstop. But you know, you talk about the NDP and trying to figure out what their position is on the carbon tax. And now that the supply and confidence agreement is over, we're now seeing the Liberals trying to stake out this ground on progressive territory. And they're pointing to the NDP nowadays being very vocal about the argument that they're not really progressives. If they were progressive, they would have never left this deal. Is that a good proposition for the Liberals to try to rebuild some support?
I think it is probably a good one for them. It does give them one way to differentiate themselves from the New Democrats. For the NDP to become an anti-carbon tax party, if that's the direction that they decide to take, I'm not sure if that will work out for them very well, considering that the Conservatives are already there. But we have seen David Eby in British Columbia, Wab Kinew in Manitoba, the NDP in Saskatchewan, and in Alberta, moving away from those issues. So in Western Canada, where it is primarily a blue-orange fight, might be a good issue for them. In Ontario, in Quebec, parts of Atlantic Canada, I'm not sure if getting away from the environmental issue as an important issue for the NDP. I'm not sure if that helps for them because their support is generally progressives. In Western Canada, it's a little bit more mixed as we see at the provincial level.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned Western Canada. I do want to also talk about the by-election, particularly in Elmwood-Transcona. You know, we know that the loss of Montreal is not good for the Liberals right now, but when it comes to Elmwood-Transcona, I'm wondering what you might extrapolate out of that race, because the NDP performed almost as well as they have. But what really was interesting was the amount of support the Conservatives were able to build in that riding 2024 versus 2021. What does that tell you about any future election?
It is a really interesting outcome because, as you said, the NDP vote more or less held up. They only dropped less than 2 points. They still got nearly 50% of the vote in that riding. It was the Conservatives that gained about 16 points. If that happens in other parts of Western Canada, the BC Interior, Northern Ontario, that is going to be rough news for the New Democrats. But if it is something that was more, let's say, Manitoba specific, probably not a big problem for the NDP. The problem would be for the Liberals. Their vote dropped 10 points. The Conservatives increased, like I said, 15, 16 points. There's a lot of other seats in Winnipeg that aren't blue-orange races. They're blue-red races. But if the Conservatives pick up that much support, there's not going to be a lot of Liberal MPs from Winnipeg left.
Okay, something to watch out for. Eric, always appreciate the insight. Thank you for this.
All right, thank you.